Hi, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you all so much for joining us. We're very excited to be here and to have you all here. This should be a great session on caregiving. We're excited to welcome Mike Knaapen here. He was at our volunteer meeting last year and got rave reviews, so we are really excited about this presentation. So Mike will be speaking for the first hour or so, give or take, of the presentation. He wants it to be sort of interactive, so he'll be asking you all some questions and asking for feedback. And then in the last half hour of the presentation, we will have a panel of a couple of caregivers who will come up, and you'll get a chance to ask questions of them as well as of Mike so that you all can have a little bit more discussion. So Mike Knaapen is the Director of Patient and Caregiver Programs for the Pulmonary Hypertension Association. In that role, he oversees PHA's support group network, including in-person groups, telephone support groups, and moderated social media groups, and he directs the PHA's international pediatric and associated disease outreach programs. He sits on the Global Advocacy Leadership Council and is a member of the National Alliance for Caregiving's Caregiver Pathways Task Force, which seeks to distinguish and prioritize the caregiver voice in medical product development. Please welcome Mike.
Thank you so much, Kate. Thank you. Good afternoon. How many folks in here are caregivers? That's very intimidating. You know who's not a caregiver? I say that, very wise point. So I say that as a way to sort of set up what this conversation is and what it is not. What it is not is a lecture by an expert. What it is an opportunity for people with real expertise to discuss some of the issues involved in caregiving, and for me to sort of prompt some conversations, get you thinking, get the head nodding, and get you disagreeing, pointing out areas that are distinct and unique to your experience. So again, you are the experts. I have a few disclaimers to make. I'm an employee of the Pulmonary Hypertension Association. How many of you are familiar with pulmonary hypertension? Very good. So those of you who raised your hands know that it can arise from pulmonary fibrosis. So we are sister diseases, which is why I'm here, because we are also sister organizations. I'm a member of the National Alliance for Caregiving's Caregiver Pathways Task Force. I've worked with them on a lot of research, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that research today. Research in rare caregiving. I'm not a medical doctor, and I'm not a licensed mental health professional, so I just want to encourage you at the outset to seek medical or mental health advice from a credentialed professional. And finally, as all of you are very well aware, and I probably don't need to make this disclaimer to you, any conversation about caregiving is going to be tough. There are tough things to talk about. There are emotional things to talk about. We may talk about the passages or the experience of bereavement of loved ones, and we may talk about some extreme emotions, and that's all okay here. That's all okay here. Our goals today are to define caregiver. Easy, right? That'll take us 2 seconds. To discuss caregiving roles and challenges, and then to empower ourselves with resources, tips, and strategies. I'm looking at all of you. You are the experts. So get ready with your tips and your strategies. I want to begin where I began. How many of you, by a show of hands, were at the conference last year, the volunteer conference in Chicago? Okay, you can all leave, because this is the same presentation I did last year. I'm kidding. I'm actually going to need your help. I was invited to give this talk last year about caregiving by Kate. So that's my way of throwing Kate right under the bus from the beginning. Any problems, talk to Kate. And I thought, what's the best way to start such a presentation? And of course, it's definitions. right? Defining what it is we're talking about, which is caregivers. That shouldn't be hard. I will just Google the definition. And what I found was a family member or paid helper who regularly looks after a child or a sick, elderly, or disabled person. That's fine. It's a bit lackluster. I thought maybe we can do better if we go to the law. Maybe there's a law about caregiving. Does anyone know if there's a law about caregiving? Do you know that there is a law about caregiving? It's called the Raise Family Caregivers Act, and it was created in 2017 by Congress. It was signed into law in early 2018. It's not a very strong law. It basically calls for sort of one of those blue ribbon commissions, but heck, I'll take it. It's a start. It's the first time we've ever had a law about caregiving in the United States. And short of course, different aspects of caregiving like home health and respite, those things, there's lots of laws about those things. But this was our first law in caregiving. And so many of you may know that any good law starts with definitions. So I looked at the definition in the law. What does the law say a caregiver is? I look it up and it says, an adult family member or other individual who has a significant relationship with and who provides a broad range of assistance to an individual with a chronic or other health condition, disability, or functional limitation. Boy, can lawyers talk. So I really loved this definition. I thought this was a very thorough definition. I loved everything about it except the first word. Adult. How many of you have had an experience in your life with pulmonary fibrosis or any other condition where a family caregiver was a child? You can raise your hands. Where a child or a young adult played a role in caregiving. Yes, any aspect of caregiving. It's very, very common. So I felt that the law sort of failed us here. And so I also pursued my own resources, things that I had developed for the Pulmonary Hypertension Association, including our Roadmap to Hope, which is sort of the thing we give to newly diagnosed pulmonary hypertension patients. In this resource, we gave our own definition of caregiver. And we did this for a very specific reason, because if this is the first thing a newly diagnosed patient is going to see, we thought, well, the caregiver should see that too. And that, of course, came out of several conversations, and we were having these conversations, and someone says to me, and I won't say who, but they said, why do you need to mention caregivers in the newly diagnosed resource thing? Don't they get their own stuff? And I looked at them and I said, you think that they got caregiver boot camp? How many of you went to caregiver boot camp? How many of you, your loved one was told you have pulmonary fibrosis, just a moment, I need to take your spouse into the next room and walk them through how to do these procedures and what to monitor and what to look out for, and here's the book on it, and I'm going to run them through their course. How many of you went through caregiver boot camp? I don't see any hands. How many of you learned by experience? I see a few hands there. How many of you learned in some other way how to be a caregiver? Would you like to talk about that?
I was a home health nurse and hospice nurse, so I had a pretty good idea of what it is to take care of people.
So she's saying that she was herself a home health nurse, so she had this intuitive knowledge. She had expertise, in fact, in being a home health nurse. I should say that if we have questions, I want to make sure we get a microphone to you so that you can be recorded for posterity in the recording of this session. Yeah. Sure. Is that better? Okay. Is that better, everybody? Great. Okay. I'm normally not quiet. That's great. Yes, so has anyone else learned how to be a caregiver from some other kind of experience? Okay, think about it. But so there's no caregiver boot camp. So we knew that if we were providing educational resources to someone with PH, we needed to educate their caregiver too. And that is partly for another really interesting reason, which is not everybody identifies as a caregiver. By a show of hands, how many people here identify as a caregiver? Okay. How many of you identify as something else? And what would you say that you are, if not a caregiver?
My sister, and she's very stubborn about caregiving.
Okay.
Trying to give care, stubborn about receiving it.
What I'm hearing is you're just her sister.
I'm her sister.
You're her sister, right? I'm not her caregiver, I'm her sister, right? And I hear that a lot. How many of you, when you're asked, you say, well, I'm not a caregiver, I'm her husband. I'm his wife. There's like this kind of disconnect. Why are you giving me this new special name? That's my job. I'm her son. It's what I'm supposed to do, right? It's this implicit nature of the relationship that already exists. So a lot of people, for that reason, will say, I'm not really a caregiver. And there are other reasons people may not use the term caregiver. For example, it sounds like you are doing a job. You're doing this thing. You are giving this care. But if you talk to people in palliative care, short detour, how many of us are familiar with palliative care? I love seeing all those hands up. Could you raise your hands again, familiar with palliative care? Over here in the middle, would you mind giving your best definition of what palliative care is?
Comfort measures, comfort and whatever will help make a patient's life, quality of life better.
Quality of life, comfort measures. I love that. I love that. And next to you, I think you said you were familiar with it.
Yes.
Would you offer another
Yes,
definition?
and pretty much the same thing.
Yeah.
It's different from hospice. It's, in fact, improving quality of life as the process of the disease goes on.
That's right. And when is palliative care appropriate for someone with chronic disease? When do we think about palliative care? Early? Early? I'm hearing a lot of earlies. Anybody disagree with early? It's not a trick question. You don't want...
Early is what we all know that it should be,
Yes.
but it typically ends up being very late.
Yes.
If you don't approach it as the family caregiver, whatever, it ends up being very late in the process for
Yes. I love what you said there. She was saying not only should it be early, but it isn't always. And we as caregivers, as loved ones, we have a responsibility, knowing that, to bring that into the conversation. That's not easy. I don't pretend that any of this is easy, but it is important. Palliative care, according to the National Hospice and Palliative Care Organization, which creates the guidelines on palliative care in the United States, explicitly states that palliative care is appropriate at any stage of chronic disease. And that is why we say early. We say it in pulmonary hypertension as well. Palliative care early. Now, our palliative care experts, and I bet Kate's over here, she's just reading the whole study. She's like, I've heard Mike talk. But she's reading this study here. So this is a wonderful study about caregiving by palliative care professionals. And what these wonderful folks determined is that caregiver has this kind of weird linguistic trap which sets up the person in that role to not think about themselves. I'm just giving the care. Care for me is not really material. And we know that that's not true, don't we? We may not always act like it's true, but we know it's true. Care for ourselves is very important. And this wonderful study by the palliative care professionals referred to the term care partner. Has anyone heard the term care partner before? Are we familiar with care partner? Okay, so that's pretty new here. Care partner is very commonly used in Europe. It's more commonly used by industry professionals and in large healthcare systems, but it hasn't quite reached everyday life and everyday people living with these situations. But care partner is a nice term, I think, because it assumes that there's a mutual relationship of care. And I think that that's important. And something the palliative care folks identified, I'm going to share this term with you, and I bet you're going to understand what it means, even if you've never heard it before. Okay, are you ready for this new term? Second-order patient. I'm hearing a lot of mms in the room, right? Like, oh, that makes sense, that makes sense. What do you think a second-order patient is? No wrong answers. Anybody have any ideas what a second-order patient is? Mary, you get to talk later. Go ahead.
I'm just wondering, is it, so if my husband had a disease and I was taking care of him throughout the disease, I kind of feel like I had the disease too.
I love that. I have the disease too.
Yeah.
Right? That's not, medically, scientifically what we mean, but it's intuitive, right? I have the disease too. Does that resonate with everyone? What it means is that your healths are related. Your health is related to the person you're taking care of or a care partner with. If you're not doing well, you can't be a caregiver, right? We all know that that's true. If you get sick, if you're burnt out, if your energy is low, if you haven't slept, there's very little you'll be able to do. And so in palliative care, which is another reason that PFF, PHA, all of us patient advocates, most of our great medical community promote palliative care, in palliative care, they care about your health too. Palliative care professionals will ask about your wife, your husband, your parents. They want to know how they're doing. Does that resonate with everyone? Great. So we're all going to ask about palliative care if we haven't already. Good. My job is done. Care partner, again, just that term that's a little bit more used in maybe Europe and referring more to that mutual level of care. But again, there are so many people that you say, are you their caregiver? And they say, no, I'm her husband, right? So thinking of ourselves as caregivers at some times can be helpful, because then you're going to, this whole new world of caregiver resources, being part of support groups where the term caregiver is used, that includes you. They're talking about you. So owning that term a little bit more for yourself is something I would encourage you to think about. Even if it doesn't feel intuitive to you, it could open up a lot of possibilities for resources and support for you. I'm going to tell just a quick story from some friends of mine, Mike and Jack. Mike says, some may call me a caregiver, but I feel more like I'm a partner in this disease. At first, I really didn't play a big part in this, besides being emotionally supportive. Since my wife's been put on a medical pump, however, I've played a bigger role than I could have ever imagined. For the most part, she mixes her own medicine, but I do from time to time to help her. I do the dressing changes, but this is just a small part of what I do. My biggest role is as her advocate, and by learning as much as I can about this disease, she really is my hero. How many of you sort of resonate with this story? Yes. What about this resonates for you? We have a microphone for you here.
Both my parents were dying and our older sister passed away.
I'm
It was
so
like
sorry.
we were the second set of ears, that we were a necessary cog in the wheel because we had to be there to validate what they heard, what my sister heard, what my parents heard, and what my other sister hears. Somebody needed to be there to make sure she was hearing it correctly.
Mm-hmm. That's a very brilliant observation. It's a great insight. We're going to talk a little bit more about the role of caregivers in a few more slides. Be thinking about the role you've played as a caregiver or caregivers have played in your life. What else about this story resonates with those of you in the room who've been caregivers? I'm going to reread this passage. Just 2 words. Just 2 words. I'm not going to reread the whole thing. I'm going to reread 2 words. And I want to see if you pick up on something I thought was really interesting. At first. You know where I'm going with this? Our role as a caregiver may change, right? you don't always have the same set of tasks that are needed. The person may not always be in the same exact condition of health or health status, right? So being a caregiver is not a monolithic truth. It's not something that's absolute, right? Has that been your experience? Did being a caregiver evolve and change over time? How did it evolve or change? Those of you who are caregivers, can you think back to a time maybe when my loved one was first diagnosed, here was my job, boom, boom, boom. But then it changed. And then maybe it changed again. Could you share an experience about how that role has changed for you? Yeah, we'll get a microphone to you. Oh, we have in the back.
Okay, in the very beginning when my husband got the diagnosis of IPF, of course we went straight to the internet, well I did anyway, and read the 3 to 5 year life expectancy and how horrible this was going to be. And initially, my role was like the queen of anxiety, and I felt like I had to protect him from everything. And I remember he was going to make a business trip. He had oxygen by then, and he was going to make a business trip on an airplane, and I just begged him not to do it. I knew he'd die on that airplane, but then he made it back. So and he did well. So I began to relax a little. So yes, it was quite an evolution from sheer panic into, getting more comfortable with the role and really understanding more about the disease, the condition, and really what was reasonable to expect, as far as diet, therapy, and, all the other things. But yeah, what a road it was.
Yeah. Would you like to share your experience?
Well, I was similarly, when he was first diagnosed, it was almost like a feeling of an accidental diagnosis, so to speak.
Yeah.
We weren't expecting anything like this. We thought we were going back for a follow-up on serial CT scans that had been done, and they were going to say, okay, it's cleared, or nothing's changed, let us know if there's anything going on. But no, we got, we're pretty sure you have pulmonary fibrosis, and since you're young, you're relatively young, you're a candidate, could be a candidate for a lung transplant. And everybody's like, holy crap, how did we go from coming here to have him say, okay, you'll be on your way, let us know if you have any problems in the future, to this. But he wasn't on oxygen. He didn't have a lot of the typical type symptoms. So really at first, I didn't have a big part. I still don't, he still mostly takes care of everything on his own. The first change that I really noticed is when he started using oxygen. And when we like to travel, so when we travel, now we have equipment that goes with us, so there's more to pulling stuff around and, and doing things like that. So that part's, that's been a first level change. But I know down the line from being a caregiver for my sister for different reasons, things change in the line, and you don't necessarily know when you're to expect it. It's just one day the change is there, and you have to hit it head on, I guess. So.
Yeah. At our conference last year, someone responded to a similar question by saying, when I was first my husband's caregiver, this was the spouse of a husband, and she said, my husband, wasn't doing very well and all of this, and so I did a lot. I did a lot of almost like light nursing tasks. And then he had a transplant, and it was a very successful transplant, and now he's doing very well. So she said, I'm actually in this kind of weird stage of having less to do, and I'm not used to that. That was a kind of adjustment she had to make. So, yes, go ahead.
I can speak loud. I just want to say that in my instance, it was more mental caregiving in the beginning than it was physical, because he didn't have a lot of the symptoms, but it was up here, the mental anxiety and the mental, what's the word I'm looking for? Depression about the disease.
Yeah, thank you, Debbie. So it sounds like a lot of us can relate to that, and that makes a lot of sense, that being a caregiver is not a static, but a dynamic thing. So I want to talk through, those of you who were with us last year will definitely remember these slides. It's a bunch of little bodies that fill in with colors. In 2018, I was so fortunate to be a part of the National Alliance for Caregiving's Rare Diseases in America study, which is so top secret it's going to flash on and off so that you can't take a picture. And in this study, we surveyed some 1,000 rare disease caregivers in America. It's the first time a study of this type had been done. We just asked people how they were feeling about being a caregiver, what kinds of jobs they had to do, all of this. It was a wonderful study. And so now I'd like to sort of go through and some of the big highlights. Now remember, this is not pulmonary fibrosis specific. It's rare diseases, okay? So it may not exactly line up, and that's where you come in and you educate me about what the pulmonary fibrosis caregiving experience is like, where it matches up and where it does not, okay? So we're going to do this as kind of a bit of a game, all right? You're going to get a slide like this with little empty people, and I'm going to ask you what percent you think a certain thing is, okay? So here's our first one. Talking about what caregivers do. What percent of caregivers in this rare disease study said that they help their recipient with medical and or nursing tasks? What do you think it is? You can go ahead and shout out. 90%, 90%, 80%, 70? All right. Survey says 84%. Wait for the gasps to die down. How many of you were surprised by that answer? Over here in the corner, you're drinking the water. Why surprised? What surprised you? Did you expect it to be higher? Or you expected it to be lower? So in your experience, this was not... Well, look around you. You have a lot of support, a lot of people to help you through this.
I thought it would be lower too, only because of my experience with my husband.
I didn't have to help him with oxygen, you know. With this disease, it's not like, you know, there's wounds and there's dressings and there's all these things. It was just oxygen, which he could manage by himself. Until the end, he still did it. Sometimes I'd have to check on things a little bit, but not for the most part. There wasn't a whole lot I had to do. But what I found that I had to do more of were household things. Making sure that he wouldn't have to go up and down the steps because we have a 2-story house, so I would make sure that...
You're ruining the next slide.
Oh, sorry.
I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding.
But that was my experience with it.
Just kidding. That is a wonderful point, right? In the pulmonary fibrosis community, maybe this plays a lesser role. In my world of pulmonary hypertension, I can tell you most folks were surprised that this number was as low as it was because they're very used to helping with medical pump changes, which is a very common thing in pulmonary hypertension. So let's move on. I think now we've had a good test run. This is your question. What percent of caregivers help with at least one activity of daily living? And an activity of daily living is not a general concept. That is a very specific medical definition. There's a list. I think it's 7 different things. So we're talking about bathing, toileting, dressing, continence, and a few others. So those kinds of things that are just fundamental to daily life. What percent of caregivers help with at least one of those? What's your guess? 60%. What was that? 95. 100%. 50. Survey says 62. 62%. More surprised. Why are we surprised? You said 90. Does 62 resonate with most of us? Does that sound about right in our experience, or do we think it's a little different for us? A little different for us? Mary?
I think it changes over the course of the disease.
Bingo. Bingo, yes. No, you're exactly right, Mary. Of course you're right. If you've met Mary, you know she's right. So, of course she's right, and that was reflected in the study. There were a number of comments at this particular point that said, well, I'm a parent of a very sick child, most of the time with a rare form of epilepsy. This was a really common response we got, was rare forms of epilepsy in parents. And parents said, most of the time my kid's okay, but when they need me, they really need me, right? So that was a really common reflection of daily living and the interaction there. And that's why this number looks just a little, it looks both too high and too low to a lot of people. So next up, this is my favorite. What percent of caregivers educate healthcare professionals about their loved one's condition? Going once, going twice. 89%. 89%. It's extremely high, isn't it? And it sounds like everyone can relate to that. In what context have you had to educate a healthcare professional about your loved one's condition? When has that happened for you? Go ahead.
Oh, I just have helped my husband by interpreting sometimes also, but letting the doctor...
We'll get you a microphone here so everybody at home can hear too.
I have helped my husband understand, too, what the doctor is saying, and then sometimes my husband can't quite figure out what to say, and he knows I can, so I do.
So Susie had said earlier that she will share something about, she shared something about your sister. You were kind of did some reporting on behalf of your sister, and it sounds like Karen is saying she's done some interpreting, right? So there's a lot of roles the caregiver can play with the medical team. Anybody else have a story to share about educating a healthcare professional? We have a very active crowd up here.
So my husband was just transplanted in July. He does not know this, so please no one tell him this. But he got really sick after the transplant, and he was being very stubborn and didn't want to go to the doctor. So at 4 o'clock in the morning when I'm up with him and he's miserable, I went upstairs and I'm texting the doctor, telling him what's going on. And you know, he responded to me not long after that. And then, and I told him, please don't tell my husband. He doesn't want you to know, da-da-da-da-da. And then he called him later that day and just to check up on him and made him come in.
Yeah, so
because sometimes they don't want to. They're just, he's like, I don't want to deal with it. I don't want to go, blah, blah, blah.
In a few slides, I'm going to talk a little bit about the role of caregivers in medical product development. And one of the big discussions we have is these roles as being what we call being a reporter or being a surrogate. Those are kind of wonky terms, but I think we've all played that role. And we probably intuitively know what those things are for our loved one. So I have had to say, you know, we'll do this now because it's just such an important topic. How many times have you been with your healthcare team, you know, right there with the pulmonologist, you know, the key person in your medical care, and your spouse, we'll say it's your spouse is sitting there and they're, you know, they sit down with the doc and the doc says, how are you doing? And they go, oh, fine. And you look over at them, say, fine? Let me tell you what's really going on, right? Right? That's being a reporter, and it is essential. It's essential to your loved one's care. It's essential to your care. And it is also essential in medical product development, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a few slides. So I'm going to try to whip through a few of these rather quickly, and we'll be able to talk about them at the end if we have some time. Okay, percent of caregivers who say providing care is emotionally stressful. A third, 2/3, 100%? 2/3? Yeah, I don't get it either. 2/3. 2/3 reported that it was emotionally stressful. I have a thought about this. A lot of caregivers, I believe, when they read a question like that, they think, I don't want my loved one to know this. I don't want them to think I have these feelings, that I begrudge them their illness. And so I'm going to say this is not emotionally stressful. I'm seeing some nodding heads and some knowing smiles, so I think that you understand where I'm coming from with that, right? And so I think even surveys like this, which, your loved one has no chance whatever of seeing your answer, that still lives with us, a little bit of that guilt, right? I think it's a reflection of that. So percent of caregivers who feel alone in caregiving. About 50% said that they felt alone. And I imagine that these are primarily folks who are not involved in something like the PFF, who don't have a sense of community, who don't attend support groups, and who maybe just stay home and provide care. And of course, maybe that's not a great reflection of the PF community per se, but among rare disease caregivers, a sense of isolation and loneliness is very common, especially at the beginning. So I think that response makes sense. And I think that there's a lot that you all have done to change that for yourselves. And I applaud you for that. What percent of caregivers report poor emotional or mental health? Similar to that earlier question, right? 40%. Does that line up with your experience? No, I'm hearing some like, no, absolutely not. I have very poor emotional health. Why would you say no, that it doesn't line up with your experience? Yes. Someone over here said no. We'll get you a microphone so everybody can enjoy your comments.
It's, I think, been a more emotional thing for me than it has for him. And people offer support, but I don't seem to want it. I want to handle it by myself. I think that makes it more difficult.
That makes a lot of sense. That makes a lot of sense. Has anyone else here ever felt that way? Wanting to handle things yourself? Right? Yes? We're going to get you a microphone.
I'm a breast cancer survivor, stage 2, double mastectomy. I went through all the emotions, and I found myself being more supportive for everybody else than myself. It was a very draining process. And now for our nephew that's going through this battle, he wants the support, but he's pushing us away with his medical mental state because he's in the profession. He's a nurse practitioner, so he's kind of wanting us his support, but he doesn't really know emotionally how to handle it besides the clinical side. So I'm trying to find my way through that because being a survivor myself and been down this road a little bit, I think just keep pushing and there's going to be some kind of balance that we'll find. But just keep pushing. Even though you don't want the help, you're going to dig deep and you're going to find it. And then that's when you find it in yourself to reach out for your loved one.
Yeah, thank you very much. Is it Sherry? Thank you, Sherry. What I heard you saying is that sometimes even when we want it, we don't know how to ask, and we don't even always know what it is. And support can take a lot of different forms. For some of us, it's a support group, and those are great. For others, maybe it's just one person we can check in with. It can vary for people. So I really appreciate your comment, Sherry. All right, getting help from others. What percent of caregivers use respite care services? Hint, it is shamefully low. 22%. 22%. How many of you are familiar with respite care? Would you mind sharing a definition of what respite care is? I think we have a microphone. Yep, him right there.
It's whenever you basically take a break from caregiving and there's somebody else steps in, and usually a professional that can provide that care for some period of time.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. Anyone else want to comment on respite? We'll get you a microphone here. Yeah, that's right. You said you were involved in home health.
Yeah, and what I found is the caregiver may be ready to drag on the floor, but they are not ready to say, here, you take over for me. That was really hard for so many of these family members who could not go away and relax for a few minutes or a few hours even. I found that very often the case.
Did you have a strategy for helping them understand respite was good for them?
Well, just encouraging them to know that their daughter's right here. She can do a great job and you need this. But I tell you, that bond is really tough to step away from.
You're right, and we will.
Yeah, well, probably guilt, but a lot of it is they feel like no one can do this but me. And it's their job, and you know.
So what I'm hearing at this table is that respite is really a challenge because we get this sense of guilt and sometimes control. Right? There's this control piece and this guilt piece, and that's very difficult. That's very difficult. We're going to talk more toward the end of this presentation, if we ever get there, about all of those things. What percent of caregivers receive help from one unpaid youth? I think this is such an interesting question. What percent do you think? 50? 25%. 25%. That seemed low to me. That seems low to me. And I imagine it's partly because a number of the respondents to this particular survey were coming from a pediatric condition, and most, if you're not familiar with a lot of pediatric folks, very few adults trust a child with a rare condition with another child, right? That is much less common. All right. So now a quick story about when that was not so uncommon. This is about Sarah, who is the mom on off stage left there, and Orion, who is her son who's immediately next to her. Her other 3 children are there with her. She says, although I'm not paid and my son doesn't always appear ill, I give round-the-clock reminders of meds, O2, questions about how he's feeling overall, and comfort to him when he's not feeling well. However, it's not just me. His twin sister has also been a caregiver, and his sister is there. This is Orion, and this is his sister. She escorts him to the nurse when he's at school and he doesn't feel well. She's also there to help with homework from missed classes. All their friends know what to look for if my son isn't feeling well, and I have to say that's because of the daughter. I happen to know this family, and it's because of her that the friend group knows what to do. They know about his heart monitor, how to check his SATs, what to do in an emergency. I think all that care about my son are caregivers to him to some degree. Now, I found this story really interesting because it sort of opened my eyes. Is this sort of eye-opening to any of you? Is this changing a little bit about how you think about who's a caregiver, even in your own life? So what this is called, and Debbie and Mary and I have all talked about this to some extent already, there's a term for this, which is the ripple effect. Have any of you heard of the ripple effect? So the ripple effect in rare disease caregiving, and it's very particular to rare disease caregiving, is this notion that you have a very complicated, not terribly well understood condition, which sometimes has different kinds of support. Our healthcare system barely understands how to help you deal with it, all sorts of issues. And as a result, you often have multiple caregivers, and they all have a different job, right? So in Orion's case, his mom is his primary caregiver. There's no disputing that. But his sister's also a caregiver, isn't she? Yes. We'll try to get you a microphone so everybody can enjoy the wisdom you are about to impart.
In this case, the twin sister, who would have a very strong bond with a twin brother.
It's true.
I would see her, wanting to give that caregiving portion of it. I got grandkids, twins, grandson and granddaughter, and I see that being very important in this case.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, the fact that these two are twins, it does make a big difference, especially in their school environment, because they're literally in the same class. So their friend circles it's not a Venn diagram, it's just a circle. But I do believe that it's true among many children that I know that their other siblings will learn to some extent how to care for them. And I think this ripple effect is really important because it speaks to something really important Debbie has talked to me about, which is communication. Right? We haven't said that word yet today, but we've talked around communication and about it in many different ways. When you have a number of different caregivers, communication is essential. I mean, somebody's got to be traffic cop, right? There's all sorts of comings and goings and whose job it is and who gets what information and who is making what decisions and who is doing what tasks. And all of that has to be coordinated or you're going to have chaos. You can have all sorts of problems from that being miscommunicated. So the ripple effect is both an opportunity and a challenge. We're going to talk a little more about it after a few more of these fun slides. So now we're going to move on. We've talked a bit about challenges. We've talked a bit about the role of caregivers. Now let's talk about the joys of caregiving. Many caregivers derive tremendous joy from what they're able to do for their loved one. Being able to love them in this way is very special to them. It's a very unique experience. For some caregivers, it helps give them identity. It's really essential to who they are, how they love this person. So we'll talk a little bit about the joys of caregiving. So in this rare disease caregiver study, what % of caregivers are proud of improving the understanding about the condition? 100%. 100%. Very high percent. 94%. I don't know who those 6% are. I have no idea who that person is, but 94% of rare disease caregivers said, yeah, I'm proud of that. Yeah, I know what PF is, and I tell everybody, right? What % of caregivers feel close to their care recipient? 100%. 96. 85%. 85% feel close to their care recipient. Right? So there's a lot of joy in giving care. And now I want to tell you a brief story about my friend Judy. I never got to know Terry, who passed away, but this is a wonderful story that Judy shared, and I'm going to read it to you. I learned so much when Terry was alive. He was in denial at first, so I did all the research. I learned how to cite the signs and symptoms of new things that happen. I also learned patience. I am not the most patient person in the world. Lies, she is so patient. But PH taught me to be. I learned that I loved and still do love him more than I could possibly say. I went to every appointment, every 6-minute walk, and the initial meeting with the transplant team. When he went on a sub-Q medication, I even stuck one of the needles in my own belly for a few hours, and the pain was unbearable. I wish every day he was alive so I could do it all over again. Judy's a remarkable person. I love Judy very much. She's very dear to me. And her story, I think, speaks to some of the topics we've already mentioned. First of all, that her role as a caregiver changed over time, didn't it? It evolved. Her understanding evolved. What she did for Terry changed over time. And her feelings about things changed over time. So I think her story is so special, and I really appreciated her letting me share that with you. So now, oh no, I've already spoiled it. I want to quickly hear from you about what you think the different roles are in being a caregiver. We've talked about this a little bit so far, but what are your jobs? Be as specific as you can, and just shout them out at me. Cheerleader. That's it. That's what being a caregiver is. Good, we're done. You may leave. What's that? Having a positive attitude. Cheerleader, positive attitude. Advocate. You read that on the slide. Yes. Medication management. What else? Sorry? Empathy. Did you say that last year in Chicago? I'm pretty sure. No, okay. Someone shouted that at me. Yes. Pack mule. Sherpa. What else? Emotional support. Yes. Comforter. Diet management. Diet guru, right? Thick-skinned. You're the tough one. Driver. Driver is huge. Yes. Decision maker. Reliable. Encourager. Yeah. Punching bag. Yes. Truth teller. Truth teller. I love that. Truth teller. All right. So I polled some folks that I know who are caregivers for PH patients, and I found a few answers myself. So here were some of the answers I got. Volunteer manager. Good listener. Compassionate. Financial support. Financial support. We can't underestimate that. Oftentimes the caregiver may be the breadwinner. On top of everything else. Emotional support, someone said. Medical support, someone said. Selfless. Loyal. Patient, like Judy said. Persistent. A good advocate. Oh, a good advocate is so important. Helpful. Organized. Not easy, right? Watchful. Empathetic. Emergency manager. But the most common answer I got, of course, is that a caregiver is loving. A caregiver is deeply loving. And I want to talk very briefly about the role of being a good advocate. And this goes back to what I said earlier about medical product development and sort of the future for caregivers in being an advocate for new therapies and new medical products. So, again, with the National Alliance for Caregiving, I'm part of this group that is helping to build pathways for caregivers to get their voices into conversations about medical product development. Has anyone here heard of terms like patient-centered design or the patient voice in medical product development? Does that kind of ring a bell? And there's a sense maybe you've heard of this, of the FDA and pharmaceutical companies, all of these players in medical products, wanting to hear from the patient. Well, of course, what they mean is the patient and caregiver. But they never parse out the caregiver, do they? They always say patient and go, oh, yeah. I meant the caregiver too. Our job on this task force is to try to help identify where the patient and caregiver are not the same person, where their voice will not say the same things. And this goes back to what was said earlier about those different roles, being a truth teller, being the reporter, being the surrogate. Caregivers are different, distinct individuals, and they have different opinions. Any argument there? No. So this is just a model for you of what this might look like in, for example, the Alzheimer's space. I'm sure you can imagine that Alzheimer's is a really huge community, and caregivers there tend to be the older adults or the adult children of seniors, right? That's basically what we're talking about. And so here's what that kind of looks like, what the voice of the caregiver sort of looks like in dementia. Over here on our y-axis, we have the power of the voice, the role it has, the strength it has in making decisions and so on, in medical care and so forth. And down here we have the source of the voice. Who's talking? In dementia, here's what generally occurs. The dark blue line is our patient. The patient with dementia begins as essentially asymptomatic. Their dementia is not very bad. They don't have a lot of problems yet. As their problems get worse, their ability to advocate for themselves declines. This is a very steady progression in most people who are affected with dementia. And then the caregiver must rise. And they become a surrogate and, in fact, a proxy. A proxy means a stand-in, right? That's a huge responsibility to be a proxy for someone. And so here's what this looks like in pediatric diseases. Similarly, or it's sort of the opposite, right? As the patient gets older over time, they're able to advocate for themselves. When they start out as an infant or just a young child, the caregiver has to do all the advocating for them. The parent has to make the voice heard. So these are sort of models to get us thinking about what's our voice as a surrogate, as a proxy, as a reporter, as an observer? And what does that have to do with medical product development? What I want to say in very general terms to you now is that your voice in those things matters. Currently, there's no really easy way to get that heard specifically, to get the caregiver voice in pulmonary fibrosis specifically heard by the FDA or pharmaceutical companies, et cetera. What I can tell you is that the PFF are your partners there. They will help you. They will help you make your voices heard in those opportunities. And it's essential that you are heard because you have something different to say. The patient, for example, may say, oh, I want this therapy or that therapy. The caregiver may say, well, but how am I going to help you administer that therapy? Or how much is that going to cost and how will our insurance take care of it? Or how am I going to take time off of work to get you back and forth to the hospital so often so you can get that therapy? Those are different questions that are going to come from the caregiver than the patient. And so your voice is essential in medical product development. So now let's spend our last few minutes together talking through some things that you can do. We've already touched on a number of these. So I'm going to speed through and then we're going to chat, okay? Number one, practice self-care, which is the easiest thing in the world to do. Is it the easiest thing in the world to do? No. It's very challenging and it's very patronizing for someone to come up here and say practice self-care. So I want you to think about it and talk about it amongst yourselves. Like I said, you're the experts, and I want to hear what self-care means to you and how you practice self-care. Research home health services. See what your insurance plans will allow, what your loved one's insurance plan will allow, and investigate that for yourselves. How many of you have even investigated home health services? Okay, so I want to see all those hands next time, okay? Investigate it. Look into what home health could do for you. Respite, similarly, just taking a break. So respite is administered on a very local basis. There's no sort of national respite program. It's all administered locally. So there's this wonderful organization called Arch Respite, where you can find out what your locality does for respite services. Attend a support group. Support groups are for you. They're for anyone who is affected by pulmonary fibrosis. It's not just for patients, it's for caregivers too. And I mean all of the caregivers. Everybody who's providing care and has a role in that loved one's life. Support groups are for all of those people, right? Right? Right. Ask about palliative care. Again, we all know it's important. You as a caregiver may have a really special role, and again, that palliative care may be for you too. Okay, a few more things. I know, fancy, right, Marianne? Were you just totally bowled over by the high-tech graphics we got going on up here? Connect with the National Alliance for Caregiving. Look at their research. They have some great opportunities coming up for getting you involved with medical product development. Share your opinions. Kate and the rest of the amazing PFF people can tell you how to do that and help you with campaigns that are important for you to advocate. Ask for help, be specific, and give options. Do you know what I mean by be specific and give options? What's that? Meet halfway. Okay, so here's what I mean. Sometimes you want to be specific with your ask. Has anyone ever told you that? If you've ever been in like fundraising or anything, people say, be specific with your ask. Being specific is super important, but sometimes it's not enough. So for example, somebody comes to you and they say, hey, I'd really love to help. I understand things are hard right now and you've kind of been going through a rough patch. What can I do? If you're specific, you get a lot better traction. But if you're too specific and you don't have a lot of options, you get bad traction. And here's what I mean. I have a friend who has pulmonary hypertension. And she said to me, I said, how can I help you? I know you're going through a rough patch. And she said to me, you could bake a lasagna every Thursday and bring it to my home at 7 o'clock.
That was specific. It also told me she's never tasted my cooking. So that's what I mean by have options, right? It's great to be specific. Specific is awesome. But like you said, meet halfway. Maybe I could say, can I order you a pizza at 7 o'clock? Great, yes, order me a pizza, right? So be specific, but have options. And support other caregivers. So every caregiver in this room, raise your hand. Raise them high, as high as you can. Look left. Look right. That is your support network. I charge you to help one another out, okay? So let's review really quick. What's a caregiver? Me. It is the spouse, correct? No. Who is a caregiver? Anyone who loves that person. I'll take that definition. I love that. Anyone who loves that person and cares for that person, right? What's the ripple effect and how can you make it work for you? Didn't you know there was going to be a test? Ripple effect was when many people are involved, spreading the information. That's how you make it work for you. You spread the information, you communicate, right? Name a resource you learned about today. One resource. Caregiving.org, awesome. Caregiving.org. Archrespite.org, great. And we already did this. Look left, look right. You are not alone, folks. You are not alone. Thank you so much.